This joint event, co-hosted by the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, Ahmadiyya Muslim Society and the Atheist, Secular and Humanist Society. Sorry for the slight delay. We're incredibly fortunate to be able to hold this dialogue, and we feel it's a great opportunity for two societies with widely differing religious views to come together and hold peaceful and hopefully engaging discussion. So before we start quickly, I'd like to introduce the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So the Ahmadiyya Muslim community is a fast-growing international revival movement within Islam. By the grace of God, it is the single largest Muslim community in the world, with tens of millions of adherents, united in both belief and practice, under the hand of a single Khalifa, a single spiritual leader. The community was founded in the late 19th century by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who Ahmadi Muslims claim to be the promised Messiah and divine reformer, awaited by Islam and in fact all other major world religions. And he claimed that he was commissioned to bring Muslims back to the true original teachings that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught, to spread the peace and tolerance that the true Islam teaches, and to reconnect man with the living God. The motto of the community is love for all, hatred for none. The title of tonight's event is Freedom of Speech, Where Should the Boundaries Lie? And I believe this is a discussion that is incredibly prominent in the media this year. So I'll introduce our speaker, and then the atheist chair can introduce Adrian. So we're fortunate to have Tahir Nasser, who's the spokesperson for the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. He's over there. Yep. He's spoken at many student events in the past, and is the ex-president of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Students Association. He's active in press and media work, and has recently graduated as a doctor and works in Warwick. So I'd like to introduce.
Hi there guys, my name's Jack. I'm the chair of the University of Birmingham Atheist, Secular and Humanist Society. We are a society which is open to all, for people who want to come along and talk about religion and things like that in a non-judgmental environment. We put on debates and discussions like this. Our speaker today is Adrian Bailey, who is chair of Birmingham Humanist, a society like ours which brings people together for discussion. Recently celebrated your, was it 50th anniversary? 50th anniversary last year, and yeah, have you enjoyed it today?
Thanks very much. Is it okay if I sit down? Can you hear me at the back? Okay. I should say to start with, it's very kind to be invited this evening. I'm not an expert on this subject, but I'm very happy to present the humanist point of view as I see it, and to give my opinions, most of which I'd say are not controversial in the normal sense, but hopefully will stimulate some debate. I sometimes say free speech is one of those things like full employment that's an ideal. It's not perhaps achievable except in pockets. Some would argue it's not even desirable. There's a list I've just printed off of all the restrictions to freedom of speech in the United Kingdom, before we all get too blasé about how freedom of speech is such a British institution. And these have all been democratically agreed, in theory by us. The humanist position, well, the Humanist Declaration of 2002 doesn't mention free speech explicitly, but says, we affirm the right of every human being to the greatest possible freedom compatible with the rights of others. And humanism insists that personal liberty must be combined with social responsibility. And the British Humanist Association states, we work for an open and inclusive society with freedom of belief and speech. We believe that free speech is an essential liberty without which societies can easily slide into a culture of oppression, suspicion and fear. Freedom of speech has occupied an important part in humanist thinking for centuries, and humanist organisations have always been active in campaigns for it. One of our major past campaigns was against the blasphemy laws, abolished in 2008. Although blasphemy is now not an offence here in the UK, internationally it remains a big problem, including in democratic countries such as Ireland, and in the UN, where Islamic states have been seeking to impose serious restrictions on criticising our religious beliefs. For many years we also lobbied and worked on what became the Racial and Religious Hatred Act 2006, but welcomed in particular the successful moving of an amendment which states that nothing prohibits or restricts discussion, criticism, or expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule, insult, or abuse of religious beliefs or practices. This made it clear that the law is intended to protect people, not belief. But there are still many threats to free speech today. We monitor legislation for threats and work to protect free speech, especially where the violations of the right jeopardise the free discussion of ideas and values. So some examples: we monitor the use of legal provisions against harassment, inequality legislation, which could lead to unwarranted free speech restrictions by the back door. We joined calls to change the UK libel laws. We know that our laws on defamation are among the strictest in the Western world. And we want to especially help to prevent victimisation of scientists, journalists and human rights campaigners through those laws. We advocate reform of the regulations and practices which lead bodies such as the Advertising Standards Authority and the Committee on Advertising Practice to chill free speech in the name of preventing offence. We protect and secure the right of students to freely criticise religions and other ideas and beliefs without fear of punishment under university policies. And we support work on free speech issues globally, including a recently new blasphemy law campaign. At the same time, as I say, because it's quite nuanced, the whole debate about free speech, we support restrictions on advertising that protect the public against harm from false claims. We've taken action to refer anti-medical claims of churches to advertising regulators where they've done harm to people. 10 years or so ago, when Parliament was deliberating over what kinds of speech should be made illegal, the Humanist Philosophers Group issued a short report on free speech and incitement to religious hatred. It begins by asking, why does freedom of expression matter? Why is it valuable? And what sorts of reasons, if any, can justify restricting it? The classic defence of freedom of expression, begins the report, is still John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty from 1859. At the heart of Mill's defence is the claim that freedom of thought and discussion is valuable because it's the way to get to the truth. But the truth, we can immediately see a sticking point. According to most religious believers, the divine revelations of their holy texts are the truth. So in a sense, freedom of thought and discussion might be anathema to the true believer. But whether in philosophy, science, or democracy, a rationalist like me sees freedom of expression as vitally important in creating a world that makes sense. Repressing our feelings is bad for us. But again, there's a conflict here with those religions that insist we submit to the will of God, for example by suppressing our sexuality. Freedom of expression is not necessarily absolute. The argument is made that some forms of expression are more important, worthier of protection than others. For example, sex in art versus sex in pornography, or economic versus racist arguments in the immigration debate. I'm not entirely happy with this distinction, though. It seems somewhat arbitrary and patronising. Wherever we draw the line, restrictions can be misused. We sometimes see the horror of the effect of strict laws in certain countries. Above all, police forces, courts and governments are not very good at distinguishing between what is acceptable speech and what isn't. So we want to give them as little power as possible to make those decisions for us. Should the state protect religion? Blasphemy law was abolished, as I said, in 2008 in the UK. To quote, "Sometimes mockery and ridicule are legitimate ways of criticising beliefs and ideas, including religious beliefs, even if they give offence. The freedom to criticise religion and religious leaders does not include a licence to hurl indiscriminate abuse, but may include satire and parody as legitimate critical devices. Often the best way to show the flaws in a view is to throw it into sharp relief. This is as true in philosophy and religion as in politics. Voltaire's Candide, for instance, witnesses every kind of human misery in his travels, and by the end of his adventures, all the ingenious theological manoeuvres to explain how God could permit such sufferings are revealed as sophistries. This effect could not have been achieved by dry argument. Monty Python's Life of Brian addresses the moral arrogance of Christianity by rewriting the story of its origins. The Satanic Verses performs a similar service for Islam. Whatever one may think of these criticisms of religious beliefs, the point is that they are of a kind which we need to make in this distinctive way, a way which is bound to cause offence. principle which said that criticism is acceptable but ridicule is not, would prevent all sorts of useful and important points from being made. Perhaps we can distinguish between ridiculing ideas and ridiculing the people that hold them, but that's not always easy in practice. Whether something is offensive is subjective. The concept of harm seems more objective. Mill said it, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." Mill didn't think that expression of beliefs could harm anyone. Only incitements to wrongdoing were potentially harmful. But he drew the concept of harm too narrowly, since speech can also harm by stigmatizing an individual or a group. So it's thought that there's a need for a law against incitement to religious hatred. But not only to religious hatred, but hatred of any person or group. But is such legislation too broad and possibly unworkable? The Public Order Act 1986, as subsequently amended, prohibits hatred by means of threatening or abusive words or behaviour against a group of persons by reason of the group's colour, race, sexual orientation, religion, nationality, citizenship, ethnic or national origins. But you'll notice there are certain groups missed out of that list. It was acknowledged that expressions of racial hatred were injurious to society, especially in a multicultural society, and it was worth curbing free speech to reduce conflict. The law on racial hatred hasn't eliminated racism, but it seems to have helped with its gradual reduction. It works partly as a public statement of the unacceptability of racism. There's a law stopping people saying racist things, make them less racist, and improve relations between people. Is that part of the purpose of laws that restrict free speech? The extension of the law to include religion was seen as an important part of the law, suggests that the problem of dealing with this should be shouldered by the police. So that unless the police come knocking at your door, you can say whatever you like. These huge internet companies excuse their laissez-faire attitude because of the First Amendment of the USA, and they are loath to intervene. But I believe their attitude has got more to do with cost. It costs millions of pounds to monitor these websites effectively. Back in the 1990s, US websites had a very different but much more expensive attitude. I worked for a while for AOL, whose forums and chat rooms were all patrolled, not literally patrolled, by staff and volunteers who would check for illegal and abusive activity, and if someone was misbehaving, we just kicked them out. A large amount of police time, some say, in some forces they say 10% of their police time, is now being used, or you could say wasted, on investigating complaints about things people have said on Twitter. It's a shared value, I think, that we should be nice to one another. If you're nice to someone, they're likely to be nice back, and you're more likely to get what you want. But now and again, because we're angry or in a critical mood, or as a joke, we say something that others find unacceptable. I'm fairly tolerant of religions, but there are times when I become exasperated and anti-theistic, and want to indulge in a few moments of extreme blasphemy. If I do, what should happen? Well, I hope that others will show me some understanding, or point out that I'm not immune to doing or believing in stupid things myself. If someone insults me, or my family, or my beliefs, I usually shrug it off. I turn the other cheek. Unlike the Pope. Unlike the Pope, if someone insults my dead mother, I'm not going to turn violent. This is what we're taught in school. Sticks and stones can break my bones. But what if there's a constant onslaught? Telling a bullied child to ignore it won't work. Minorities in society are similarly troubled by overt or subtle oppression. But the principle still stands. Ignoring the insult should be the default position, since the alternative is too often a downward spiral of revenge. Comedians in Britain are generally good at policing themselves. As time has gone on, they've extended their unwritten rules to exclude jokes about all sorts of minorities, unless the joke is so incredibly good that even the butt of the joke admits it's damn clever. This is not true in most countries, though. Racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and so on are still rife in the humour and general speech of most parts of the earth. Successful multicultural cities, such as London today, many other cities around the world, including cities where Muslims, Jews and Christians have lived together in relative peace for centuries, a balance has been struck. Each religious or ethnic group has tolerated the others. Free speech doesn't give you the right to insult your neighbours with impunity. I'm happy to discuss what I think is wrong with Islam, for example, to criticise it, and most Muslims would be happy to engage with me in that debate to defend their faith. But if I insult the Prophet, or put cartoons of him up around the city, I can hardly be surprised that most of them get sad and angry. Of course, provocation begets provocation. When Israel bombed Gaza, I was angry. When ISIS beheads 21 Coptic Christians, I'm angry. Whatever the atrocity may be, but I need to direct my anger at the right place. In the heat of the moment, that's not always possible, and I should be forgiven for that. We must have empathy. But that doesn't negate the general rule that it's safer to react rationally rather than emotionally to whatever outrage it might be. So let me speak about the relationship between Muslims and the West for a moment, since this is one of the key issues around this theme. Whatever non-Muslims may think about the culture of oppression within their religion or within Muslim communities, it's clear that many Muslims feel themselves oppressed by the West. In Paris or London or Birmingham, Muslims are on average poorer, live in poorer areas, do crummier jobs, often looked down on. In the Middle East, where Muslims are in the majority, they feel oppressed by the power of the West, which has installed itself militarily in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, launched successful invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and continues to be deployed in most of the countries of the region in one way or another. Muslims are still dying because of military operations. How is all this connected to freedom of speech? Well, I think violent response to insults is much more likely at the present time. When the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie in 1989, there were no militias such as Al-Qaeda, Islamic State and Boko Haram that have the numbers, reach and weaponry to mount regular attacks around the world. When 35 people died in a massacre in 1993 in Turkey when a mob set fire to the hotel while Salman Rushdie's Turkish editor was attending a conference, it was an isolated incident. Finally, I'll speak a little bit about Charlie Hebdo. The response to the Charlie Hebdo atrocity was uplifting in a way, but it was also concerning. It was great to see such an outpouring of solidarity, but it did seem a very Western response, doing as much to alienate Muslims in Paris as to assert their belonging. To most Muslims, what Charlie Hebdo was doing was very hurtful. 48 hours before the publication of the famous issue, the French government advised them not to publish. How many of those people on the demonstrations are really Charlie? How many of us here are Charlie? I resisted the temptation to say je suis Charlie, and I still do. Does that seem callous? I hope not. Apparently the Saudi ambassador is Charlie, but not me. I'm happy to say je suis Charles, the nickname of the murdered editor, and to identify myself with all the other people murdered in the Paris attacks. I'm willing to identify myself with the murdered journalists, cops, Gazans, whoever, absolutely because I believe no one has the right to take away another person's life for any reason without their permission. So why not je suis Paris, je suis Paris? Wouldn't this have been a much better slogan for the aftermath? But, perhaps unfortunately, the emphasis was put on freedom of the press rather than the freedom to live. Thanks.
I'd now like to invite Tahir Nasser to come and deliver his speech.
Hello there, everyone. So, my name is Tahir Nasser. It's lovely to be here this evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming and thank the organisers for inviting me. It's a good way to start, coughing. And thank you for that wonderful talk. I think there was a lot to that in some respects we can agree on, but there's plenty left for the discussion. So free speech, where should the boundaries lie? Can you hear me at the back? Good, okay. So what I'm going to be talking about, I'm giving a summary before I start, is where the boundaries lie. That's the first question. Examples of free speech curtailment, fairly similar to yours as well. I thought that was an obvious way to go. Mockery and dehumanization is an important thing I want to cover. Where does satire fit into mockery? Islam and free speech, and the purpose of free speech, which is, I think, the most important thing out of all of this evening. So by saying where do the boundaries lie, I think we all agree that there's already an assumption that the boundaries do lie somewhere, and the question is, where is that, right? So there are many examples of where the boundaries lie already. The lower boundary, you might call it. So racism, sexism, hate speech, confidentiality agreements in the UK and in certain professions. So in medicine, for example, you can't as a doctor disclose your patient information. That's a form of limitation of free speech. In law, if you're a juror in the law, in a court case, you can't go about talking about the court case. It's a private contractual agreement you've entered into. Freedom of speech is infringed upon by the state and is made illegal, principally when you're infringing the rights of others by your speech, and as a result dividing society and creating disorder in society. The upper boundary of freedom of speech is what we're really concerned about today. So does a right to not be offended exist? Now, I don't think that there is a right to not be offended. It's an absurd idea to say that you should have a right to not be offended, because a lot of criticism you might give somebody, they might just get offended, but actually it was completely valid criticism. But the question then is there a right to offend? And is the right to offend the same as the right to not be offended? And that's what I think we need to explore next. So one thing that's often pointed is that all religions are mocked. And these are just some examples in recent European history, so in the last 5 or 6 years, in how a lot of these things that we say, all religions are mocked, we need to mock that which is sacred, to criticise it, some of the things which have been brought up, are actually completely undermined by when we look at other examples of what happens in Europe sometimes. So this is in 2005. The French Catholic Church banned this above clothing advertisement because they call it a gratuitous insult to people's innermost beliefs. And because it's basically a picture of some lovely young ladies dressed in a particular fashion brand in the scenario of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. I don't think that's offensive at all, but some people do. And as a result, it was banned. It was also banned in Milan. Another one which is relating to religion specifically is Gillen's Posten, the Danish cartoon which published a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wearing a turban with a bomb in it, with the Islamic inscription along the front. A year previously it had refused to publish a cartoon which was derisive of Jesus, peace be upon him, because they said it would provoke an outcry. Another thing is the concept of the sacred. This is another thing, that the sacred and the concept of the sacred must be mocked. This is something we saw in the UK. In many regards, UK is no longer a particularly religious community, but we do still have those things we hold sacred. And one of those things is the concept of our armed forces and the people who have fallen, especially in World War I and World War II. And this was a young man, a university student, may I say, like a lot of you here, who got extremely drunk, unfortunately, while he was out on a pub crawl, and a picture was taken of him urinating on a memorial wreath. Now this isn't an act of speech, but it is an act. But in a way it accesses the same issue. He narrowly escaped prosecution. He narrowly escaped a jail sentence because of his contrition, and he was given 250 hours of community service for urinating on a memorial wreath, under the phrase that it was causing public outrage, which still carries to this day an unlimited prison sentence and unlimited fine, dependent on the magistrate's decision. Something I didn't know that still existed within British law. Not something I agree with at all, actually. Again, the sacred must be mocked. Maurice Signet, who was a columnist for Charlie Hebdo, he was sacked from Charlie Hebdo by Philippe Val, the man who published the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because he made a statement in a column of his which said, "He'll go far, that boy," referring to François Hollande's son, who had converted to Judaism and who had married a Jewish heiress. And the reason he wrote that in his column was because he was playing on the stereotype that Jewish people are rich, and therefore by converting and marrying he would be advancing his social prospects. And he was actually sacked by the man who published these things who published the Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because he said that this is an unwarranted use of freedom of speech. Another thing is the mockery of the dead is acceptable. If you're dead, you can be mocked. A really interesting example I came across was Harakiri Hebdo, which preceded Charlie Hebdo, which was actually banned by the French government in 1970 because they mocked the death of Charles de Gaulle, which is very interesting. The Holocaust denial, which is a very insidious and sinister manner of anti-Semitism often, is actually prosecutable in many countries. So David Irving, who's a well-known fascist actually, was sentenced to 3 years in prison in Austria because of Holocaust denial. Now the question about this is that if this is a limitation on free speech and free belief actually, should we then mock Holocaust victims because of this as a response? And would that be an appropriate and responsible manner of behaviour? And these are just some examples of how it's been mentioned already in the talk that's been given, that mockery, ridicule is a valid means of criticism. And these are some examples. One, which is fairly old, 19th century, during the American Civil War, depicting the difference between the Republican and the Democrat Party in their attitudes towards the Emancipation Bill in America at the time of Abraham Lincoln. And look at the manner in which they depict the black individual, the African individual, and the way they depict the Caucasian individual. On the far left is a poster which was used as part of Nazi propaganda and depicting Jews in a very derogatory and harmful way, that they are sinister, ugly, that they are, and often a lot of the propaganda posters would insinuate that they are money grabbing and that they're ruining German economy. And on the far right here is possibly one of the results of dehumanization, ridicule of a particular community's beliefs. And it's 3 individuals who were recently murdered by an anti-theist, or himself identifying as an anti-theist. We do not yet know the motivation, but one of the motivations could very well be, and it has been widely aired in the media, that it could be simply because he got to a point where he hated the religions and he hated the symbols of religion, that he murdered these 3 young promising individuals. Now the question therefore arises, is there a right to offend? And getting back to this, I would say there's no right to offend at all. You don't have a right to insult somebody. But there is a right to not be offended, and there's a difference between the two. Because to purposefully offend someone, with the intention of offending someone, is a gratuitous insult, as it was pointed out by the French magistrates. And it results in a fracturing of society and disturbing social peace. And I want to come back to this point when we talk about the purpose of freedom of speech. In other words, offence and insult can be taken from a legitimate criticism, and the difference between the right to be offended, the non-right to not be offended, and the right to offend, is that if I set out with the express intention of hurting you, with the express intention of causing you pain and suffering, without any kind of criticism behind it, then there's the difference between the two. It's the intention of the action that makes the action. The question then is, what is satire? Is it not satire often offensive? Well, usually it is actually. But what is the role of satire in the society as well, especially then? I would say that satire is the use of humour, irony or wit to highlight the absurdity of another person's position. And the purpose in and of itself cannot be simply to mock, dehumanise and abuse. In other words, there has to be some form of legitimate criticism beneath the satire. There's no such thing as satire if I literally just abuse another person. That's not satire. That's not clever. Satire is in a way, it's elevated and it's respected because it requires a very high degree of intelligence to frame a criticism in a humourful way which actually undermines the argument, undermines the other person's position. Abuse is not an act of intelligence. Abuse is not an act which would evoke admiration, whereas satire does. And what we've actually seen with the Charlie Hebdo and with other issues is actually a caricature, ironically, of satire, therefore. And I think satire is important when we think about satire, to think about perspective. If for example, if there's a ruling class and there's a minority, and satire is continually put upon them, and they're continually subject to ridicule through satire, is that really satire? Are you really is the use of your satire meaningful and a responsible use of it? And to what extent does it then become hate speech or propaganda? Many people would say that some of the posters of Nazi propaganda could have been also represented as satire if they were done in a community or in a scenario where Jewish people were in the majority. Obviously not the extreme types of propaganda that there were. In France we see there's an anti-burqa law. Further on there's an anti-hijab law. You can't wear a head covering if you're in a position of governmental responsibility. And what is clothing? Clothing is the outer symbol of a person's identity. And by saying to people, you cannot have this symbol of identity, you cannot represent and identify yourself in that manner, what you're effectively saying is that your views are unwelcome. Your religion is unwelcome in this society in any visible manner. To then demonstrate and to attack people's most innermost held beliefs, and to publish it widely, and to celebrate it, in actual fact, when you put the two things together, it actually amounts to a degree of persecution, I would say. And the question we need to ask ourselves is whether Danish cartoons or Charlie Hebdo's cartoons intended to level legitimate criticism at Islamic teaching. Is self-censorship therefore a good thing? Censorship is a very taboo word, and so I'd like to change it in this context, not in terms of external censorship, but self-censorship with social responsibility. And it should be an act of personal and moral obligation rather than a legal one. I don't think you should put legal restrictions on a person telling people you can't do this or that. I think it should be not indoctrinated, wrong word. It should be taught, and we should be encouraged to think and reflect about what we say. The idea that we should just spontaneously abuse because we feel an emotional outpouring and then that should be the end of it. No, we should actually try and aim for the ideal here. And Roald Dahl put it really well in the Salman Rushdie affair. He said that it puts a severe strain on the very power principle that the writer has an absolute right to say what he likes. In a civilized world, we all have a moral obligation, not illegal, a moral obligation to apply a modicum of censorship to our own work in order to reinforce this principle of freedom of speech. And this ties into the next point, that a freedom in and of itself doesn't teach you how to utilize it in the best manner. And simply the possession of a freedom is not a praiseworthy thing. It is rather the exercise of that freedom in a manner which will actually promote peace in society, promote social cohesion, and lead to, as our esteemed other speaker also said, to the acceptance and to the realization of truth. And in this sense, France, I would say, and certain individuals, are also tending towards an extremist attitude with regard to freedom of speech. The notion that freedom of speech is decontextualized from humans and from human society is quite a perverse way of looking at it. To actually focus on freedom of speech and not to look at how it actually affects and is applicable in a real-world manner to human society is actually an extremist position. It's exactly what extremists do. They take their principles and they decontextualize them from how they will affect other human beings, and then they apply them. And on this point, I want to just say a few things about Islamic teachings on freedom of speech, and how particularly you should respond to insulting or abusive speech. May I ask how many minutes I have?
6-7 minutes.
Okay, should be finished then. So these are two examples of the Islamic teachings from the Holy Quran on how you should respond to abusive speech. So it says, when you hear the signs of Allah, so the signs of Allah mean the things which may lead you to God, and which are have a sanctified position in Islam. Being denied and mocked at, sit not with them until they engage in a talk other than that, for in that case you would be like them. It doesn't say insult them, it doesn't say abuse them back, it says remove yourself from mockery and rejoin them when they stop being abusive. That's what it says. Again it says, you shall surely be tried in your possessions and in your persons, and you shall surely hear many hurtful things from those who have given the book before you. In other words, followers of previous religions. And from those who set up equals to God. Now that could be other forms of paganism, or it could be also a degree of atheism as well. But if you show patience and act righteously, that indeed is a matter of strong determination. And the attitude of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is very pertinent in this regard. He was abused for 23 years throughout his life. And often his followers, there's one incident that comes to mind where one of his followers said to a Jewish person, the Jewish person said to the follower of Muhammad, peace be upon him, that Moses is certainly much higher in station with God than Muhammad. And the Muslim got angry with the Jewish person, and he brought the issue to the attention of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Prophet Muhammad said, "Do not elevate me above Moses." And the point he was making is that in Islamic teachings, Muhammad is higher in station than Moses. But the point he was saying is that your freedom of speech isn't total and absolute. There is no need and there is no necessity in terms of social responsibility to hurt the feelings of another person simply for the sake of competition in that sense, or simply for the point of making a point about it. There should be some accurate criticism behind it. And Muslims, I think, should also bear in mind the Prophet Muhammad's teaching of forgiveness. Also, our other esteemed speaker, I'm not that esteemed, our esteemed speaker, he also referred to it when he said that forgiveness should play a part. If somebody does get abusive, you should return with forgiveness, not with abuse in the other way. And the standard of forgiveness for Muslims, I always think, is the highest with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. His own daughter, who was pregnant, was murdered by a man named Habbar. And Habbar fled, and he went to another country, and when Prophet Muhammad attained ascendancy over Arabia, he came back. He was persuaded by his own wife, who had become Muslim, to come back. And Habbar came and he asked forgiveness from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it shocks me, the fact that he said, "You're completely forgiven. You're completely forgiven for murdering my," I think it was a 23-year-old daughter, who was pregnant at the time. And that is the standard of forgiveness. So if somebody abuses the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to the Muslims in the audience especially, I'd like to say that you should respond like him. And my final point is this, that the purpose of free speech. There's no point, as I said, just to say, "Oh, we have freedom of speech," is a meaningless statement. How do you exercise that freedom of speech? Do you exercise that freedom of speech in a manner which actually makes your world, makes your society a better place? Or do you exercise it in a manner which fractures society, which doesn't recognize that other people have different views to you, hold different things sacred to you? Free speech is a means. It isn't an end in itself. It's a means to achieve peace in society and to respect and to regard everybody's rights. Did Charlie Hebdo's actions, even without the barbaric response that followed of their murder, which is totally heinous and totally condemnable, but did the cartoons in and of themselves, and the cartoons like the Danish ones, depicting the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a dog, depicting him in the nude, depicting him as disabled, are these things which were done to level legitimate criticism, or were these things simply done to offend and abuse? And did they as a result lead to a more peaceful and productive and cohesive society, or did they lead to a more fractured one? And the final point I'd like to make is that the motto of France is extremely beautiful. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. It's a very beautiful motto. Out of all of the mottos in the world, I cannot necessarily think of another one which is as beautiful as that. It was the cry of the masses in 1789. But one thing I think people have forgotten, especially in France and in Europe in general, is that to exercise your liberty in a manner which undermines your fraternity is actually a betrayal of the very principles that France claims to stand for. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, I'm going to get there.
Your talks. They were both very interesting. So I'd like now to invite the audience to ask questions to either or both of our speakers and to raise any points that you might have.
Good.
Right, we're done with
Yeah, there's a question.
You spoke a lot about social cohesion and bringing everybody together, and how freedom of speech, if used the wrong way, can act as a detriment to that. Would it therefore be worthwhile curtailing freedom of speech with respect to religious views about, I don't know, homosexuality or women or heaven and hell, for example, which could make people feel left out of society?
I think that there is there is a manner. It's not about what you say in terms of its context. It's sometimes how you say it. Now, in terms of Charlie Hebdo and the Danish cartoons, I think it was what they did and what they said. Because as I said, depicting the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a dog, that's not a legitimate criticism. That's an act of abuse. If a person holds a wrong belief, right, or a belief which, in your estimation, may be wrong, the appropriate manner for them to put that belief forward, even if it may be offensive to you, is to discuss it rationally and to discuss it respectfully with one another. And that's something that we do as individuals, and we hope we do when we talk to other people, on a normal individual basis. So why do we have to, when it comes to the issue of a nation doing it, and a nation discussing it, why do we then suddenly move to a position whereby abuse is acceptable? In terms of heaven and hell and issues with regard to women, again, if a person has a belief that is you find offensive, it depends how they present that belief, and it depends how it affects you in terms of your whether they're doing it as a criticism or and in a kind of mature fashion, or whether they're presenting their beliefs in an abusive manner. If, for example, I understand there are certain Muslims who went around England putting up posters saying, you know, Sharia law zone free, and they were telling women to cover their heads and things, which is in itself totally against the teachings of Islam. But if that is in actual fact what they believe, then the way they were doing it was still an abusive manner of doing it. They were imposing their views upon someone else. And so I think you have to look at the way, and you have to take things on a case-by-case basis, rather than making blanket statements about things.
I made the point about, in the past, communities had lived together, Christians and Jews and Muslims, for example. But at that time, I suppose it would be fair to say that all three groups probably had the same views about, for example, homosexuality. Whereas now, living in a secular society like Britain, the differences of opinion are much more focused, aren't they? And it's much more difficult to live together without having these matters raised often and very vocally by people who object quite rightly to these opinions. And in that case, should the law protect, in this case, for example, Muslims from being attacked for their views on homosexuality or whatever it might be?
I think the key is there's a maxim in Islam, and I'm sorry to give you anything from Islam, but there's a maxim in Islam which is the intention of an action determines the action. And I think that's a really important maxim. Because if a person makes an intention to abuse another person, and they present whatever they want with that intention, then that in its sense becomes abuse. It doesn't become criticism. And it may be whatever it may be. It may be an atheistic position. It may be a person talking about heaven and hell. Right? If the intention is to abuse and not to have a criticism and not to have a discussion, if that occurs in a repeated fashion, which is fracturing society and resulting in further radicalization of the communities within that country, then I think we need to really think seriously about how we're going to be using freedom of speech. And where does exactly the topic is today, where does the boundary lie? But I think it's the intention as to why a person speaks about a particular thing, rather than the thing itself.
I'm just struggling sort of picking out where sort of like the points of clash between each of these are. I'm interested to see if there's anything you guys disagree with each other apart from sort of like the God thing.
Well, there's one thing.
I think we're waiting for the questions to tease that out.
It's still here, isn't it? One thing you said which I disagree with, you seem to be saying that art and literature should be subject to self-censorship, and that there are limits to free speech in the arts. And I would disagree with that. I would say in the arts there should be no limits. There's a difference in my mind between the arts and journalism and TV, for example. I think there's a qualitative difference, for example, between a movie and a TV show, or between a newspaper article and a novel. And I think it's important that the arts should have no limits, and people should be able to approach a work of a novel or a movie and not expect any form of censorship to take place, to be able to to have whatever response they feel quite viscerally, and if it's a very negative response, then they should feel, why is that so negative in me? What is it that the author is attacking in me? And to be able to accept that, and not then to feel that the author should be murdered or should apologise for what they've done.
Well, I don't think there's any disagreement on whether the person should be murdered.
Okay.
So that should, let it be absolutely clear, I'm not going to keep on, as a lot of you sometimes get among Muslims, they keep on going back to that, oh, it's condemned, we condemn it, like, let me say at the beginning, we condemn murdering people because of what they say. I'm not going to say it again. In terms of the question of limitations on free speech in the arts, see, I think that if I were to give you the example of, some of the posters I put up, for example, the images, one of them was a Nazi propaganda poster against Jewish people.
Well, that's not the arts. That's
That's
why I'm making a distinction.
Well, no, there isn't that distinction. That's your distinction.
Okay.
The person who made that poster was using an art form to express a sentiment. At the end of the day, that's what he was doing. Now, you may not call that art because actually it's pure abuse. It's pure propaganda to dehumanize a community. Same thing happened with, you can get some very, very funny posters, which you look back and you think, my God, how were these ever part of advertisement in the 1950s and 60s in terms of selling products to women? And you see them all over the internet. And you ask yourself the question, is this an art form then? And if you categorically say, well, it's not an art form, well, what is it then? May I ask you, what is those posters? What are they? Where would you place them in the category of human experience?
A poster is propaganda.
But propaganda is not a form or a medium.
Well, I say
so. What is the formal medium of a poster where a person is on a painting of a Jewish person in an extremely hideous fashion?
Well, it's using a form of art, but it's not art itself.
Okay, why?
Art to me is well, I'm going to sound very pretentious by saying art is metaphor, but art is an expression of somebody's reality, and
that was.
Yeah, but it's for a particular purpose.
Art is often for a particular purpose. Lots of people write novels for the purpose of selling them. So your categorisation that art should have no limitations, you yourself have admitted actually that's not true. But by that example, you've demonstrated that actually art does have limitations. We have limitations on TV, Ofcom. Now you're saying television I don't think is art. Well, I think a lot of television writers would disagree with you. And I've seen some fantastic documentaries on TV or dramas on TV. I'd say that's definitely art. So just to say arbitrarily, oh well actually anything that doesn't necessarily fit into my picture, that's what art is, because it's abusive and because it's propaganda, that's not taking a holistic viewpoint, and you can't frame rules on the basis of that. You can't frame laws on the basis of that. And you can't build a society on the basis of that which is ambiguous as opposed to that which is clear.
But I think laws have been done on that basis. For example, when decisions were made in the past about banning books like Lady Chatterley's Lover or Lolita, and over time laws have been changed to say, well, these are works of art, they should be allowed to exist and be allowed to be published. Whereas if it was a form of pornography, they might have been banned explicitly pornography rather than art, and they would be banned. There are still restrictions on pornography in this country. So the law does make a distinction between these different forms.
Or can you say that, clarify what you mean?
Well, for example, pornography is not considered to be an art form, so the law treats it differently.
Right. But that's also because of the I'm not particularly going to go into the specific indications to what's it. My art teacher once said the difference between pornography and art is that one is clear and one is blurred, which has always amused me. But the point I think still stands insofar as yes, the law does make these distinctions in where it is clear, but there are lots of places where art and what an individual's perspective on art may be, in actual fact, is very much ambiguous, and different people have different definitions of art, which is why I think you shouldn't say art shouldn't have any limitations, because as I pointed out, there are some expressions which are evidently harmful, which are evidently fractured society and led to the death of millions of people. The question, therefore, isn't a question of modes or modalities, that this particular modality of expression should have no limitation, but this particular modality should have a limitation. The question is one of intention. And intentionality within the law is something which is a vast topic, and it's accepted within the law already. We have the question of intentionality and the difference between murder and manslaughter, for example, and they carry weighty, very different sentences as a result. So I think that basing your concept on the intention of a person's statement or an intention of a person's expression is actually the best way to go. Lolita, for example, or other books, Lady Cathley's Lover, these are books which they were written with the intention not of abusing, or demeaning, or caricaturing, or mocking, or ridiculing, or fracturing society, whereas other modes of expression had. And I would categorise Charlie Hebdo or the Danish cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad as a dog. And I keep on saying that statement. I hate saying that statement, just the very imagery in my mind, I rail against it. But I say it because I want people to understand what some of these cartoons were. They weren't just depicting the Prophet Muhammad crying, as the later Charlie Hebdo did. That's a very watered down example of what they did. There were a lot of things they did which were utterly abusive, and which were utterly repugnant, in my opinion, even to a person who doesn't believe that the Prophet Muhammad was a prophet. So I think that we need to look at the intentionality regarding a person's act rather than actually the modes or the expressions, the modality. What if in the future new technologies arrived with different modalities, right? In sensory modalities, for example, then we're going to have a whole new set of laws about sensory modalities, rather than just looking at the intention of the action behind it.
Do you want one last word, or should we go on to
Go on, that's all right.
Okay, in the red shirt at the back.
You claim that social cohesion is more important than freedom of speech. That would be also the same case for Soviet Russia. Is that such a desirable state of being?
Do you think people were at peace in Soviet Russia?
Social cohesion was there. I mean, I'm from East Germany.
I didn't mean social cohesion. When I said social cohesion, I was using it in the context of a host of terms. I wasn't just saying social cohesion. So happiness, personal happiness, right? Fulfillment, and concepts in which society is not divided and in which people are able to attain their full potential. I mean, this is by cohesion, I don't just mean people getting on with one another, because people in communist Russia didn't get along with one another. There were plenty of revolutions or attempted revolutions. So, and plenty of people, families were broken up, people were sent to prison camps, I don't think that's a very good picture of social cohesion, personally, my view.
It was just a small minority of people who were sent away. Most people were quite happy with their circumstances.
There were organizations, for example, in Russia in which churches were burned and lots of deeds were done against particular religious communities during Soviet Russia as well. So I wouldn't say that that's an example of social cohesion.
Although I
don't know whether he...
Although I've agreed to a certain extent that social cohesion is very important, and that's why one should always think twice before insulting one's neighbour. At the same time, you can't live your life in a state of repression where you feel you can't express yourself because the other person might be offended.
Absolutely, I agree.
So, I mean, that's why now and again you will maybe do something, it might be a mistake, it might be considered to be a mistake, but that should be allowed without worrying too much about is this going to affect the community, because these things are very small compared to the community at large.
I agree with you in that people should err on the side of forgiveness, and that this should be a moral obligation, not a legal one. And I try to make that clear as well. But I do think that the principle still stands, that if you're just going to say, well, and I think there's a big difference. I think you're, in a way, to a degree, you're mixing up two different things. There's a big difference between a person seeing 21 Coptic Christians beheaded, right, and then having an outpouring of emotion in which a few words of abuse are said, or something somebody might say is blasphemous, or seeing people being murdered in an office and saying something against, in one's mind saying something against Islam, for example, even though Islam and the majority of Muslims condemn such actions, and it's not their Islam. But people do make those associations. I think there's a big difference between that and building an entire magazine and purposely going out of your way to abuse somebody with, again, the intention of abuse. The intention of a spontaneous comment which is made, when you're in the office or when you're at home, because you see something which is so repugnant to you and hurts your heart. That's a world away from making cartoons in which you're purposely going out of your way to demonize, mock, ridicule another person's sacred values. Those Muslims, for example, I think it's called Islam for UK, run by the vile Anjum Chowdhury. I think it was his group who burned poppies, right? Now that was an expression that had no purpose to it, fundamentally. other than to abuse that which was held sacred by somebody else. And I would say that falls under the same category as Charlie Hebdo's actions. But it's just for a different community, and for a different community's things that they hold sacred. And that's again why I'm going back to the issue that intention and intentionality is the most important part of this discussion.
I just thought of a rather silly example I read about recently about, I think it was a couple of men, they were doing a walk from Solihull to the city centre in mankinis, and they got to Spark Hill and they were surrounded by a group of Muslims who said, you mustn't do this in our community. And
what, walk?
Walk in a mankini.
What's a mankini?
Oh, well.
I thought you said going from Solihull to Mankini. I was like, where's Mankini?
A mankini. Have you seen the film Borat?
I'm guessing. No, I'm going to guess what it is.
Yeah.
It's a bikini for a man.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. Oh, that's good powers of deduction. That was. So hold on. I need to imagine this now. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. No. Okay. Continue.
And they called the police, and the police came and told the guys to get lost. And it seemed a bit unfortunate that there wasn't that level of acceptance of something quite innocent taking place in the community. I mean, that was just a silly example, but that's just the one that came to mind.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that's quite a niche example, and again, I think that there should be a degree of flexibility and understanding between different communities as well. I would question again the intentionality of walking around in a mankini.
I suppose it works the other way as well, because often there are sometimes issues with people not accepting women wearing the niqab in the community.
Yeah, and in France it's illegal.
Okay, so another question? Yeah.
Well, two things. First was, how would you actually determine intention? Because it seems you're glossing how difficult that would be, and like whilst in clear cases, I think everyone would agree, but on the other hand, people can be misconstrued, and I think it's far more difficult to determine than you're maybe saying. And secondly, something that interested me, but this is more for both of you, it kind of reminded me of an essay by Hegel where he talks about abstract thinking, and you touched on the idea that we've basically kind of detached the notion of free speech away from any kind of relation to our community and the way people recognise each other within that. And I was wondering whether that kind of abstract thinking, like, would you consider it to have a parallel within the 20th century where, like, almost as a reaction against a series of economic issues, a personification of all those problems was emerged in the figure of the Jew. And it strikes me, one thing, that there seems to be a certain dynamic of blaming, a scapegoating almost, and that the Muslim has now become this abstract figure that's become the kind of the lightning rod for all the frustrations of a lot of people's lives. And how can we deal with that? You know?
That's a really good question. You can answer. I have to ask the first one, don't I? And then we both answer the second one. Right, not giving me much time then. Sorry. But if you could remind me what your first question
was. It was how on earth do you go about
determining intentionality?
Intention?
How do you determine intentionality? Well, I think the courts do it all the time, and I think that people who generally go out of their way to mock, dehumanize, and ridicule people for the simple purpose of doing it, often state that that's the reason they're doing it.
So great, so that's fine then.
Often it will be a person saying, yeah, well, you know, basically I hate their guts, and I hate this belief, and I want to, I mocked and ridiculed it. I didn't have any criticism. If a person takes back what they said, or feels actually, you know what, it was harmful, there was no need to say it, and that might very well fall under the realm of a spontaneous thing. And I don't think spontaneous conversation, if you say something abusive, for example, you know, that should be taken to the courts of law. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an institution that was set up, a magazine, with principally at its heart, it took the issue of Muhammad, peace be upon him, out of the category of all other particular things that people may hold sacred, and particularly targeted that. Now that would actually not only fall under the issue of doing something which was purposefully offensive, but it actually falls into a degree of a particular dehumanization or persecution of a particular community there. And this was shown, as I showed, by their attitudes towards other things that other people hold sacred. In regards to the second question, could I have you, I don't want to just talk continuously, I want to break it up a little bit as well. So,
How was this about
Sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, that's fine,
First one.
thank you. Yeah.
I think that the courts are the best
Yeah.
place for it, and the courts have a far harder time with other things.
Yeah.
If they were to do it, if it was to become a legal thing. But again, I'm not so sure it should be a legal thing. I think it should be necessarily a moral thing, and I think the UK already does this. In the UK, the cartoons largely were not published, for example, like they were in France and Germany.
So in short, you'd rather this is an issue of civil society?
Yes, absolutely. This should be an issue of civil society, absolutely. And I think the UK already does it very well, actually. And people in Britain already have that notion of sensibilities. And ironically, it might come... I was speaking to a person earlier and said that the UK, I think, is exceptional among the European nations, partly because of its colonial history, actually. It's had a long... Ironically, it's had a long time of integration and diversification with different communities, and it's kind of evolved and learnt how people should interact with each other when they hold different things as sacred.
I have to say though, before we go on to the next point, it is a shame that we can't just, you say you're not allowed to mock Muhammad, so I think, oh, just for a joke, I'm going to do it. And you think, no, I can't because I might get shot. That is a shame that there is that rule, that religion can have that rule and then kind of impose that rule on the rest of the world, not just on itself. And that is a shame. It's not really about intention then. I mean, why shouldn't someone have the intention to mock Muhammad? Because they're not allowed to. It seems like a very good reason to me to do it.
I think that there's a better reason, there's a better argument that the interaction and the respect that you would get and the in a way the kind of betterment of society you would achieve by restraint in that issue. For example, I understand Canada's national channel, the news channel, it refused to publish the cartoons, and they gave a very astute reason as to why it didn't. They said because our freedom of speech is not dependent upon insulting other people, actually. And moreover, the people who go around killing us, we don't care about them. We care about the Muslims who live in our communities. We care about the Muslims who we work and live with, and who are our friends and our neighbours. We care about them. We don't care about the others. And to shoot a bystander for something that another has done, it is a perversion of the very principles that we stand for in society. And at the end of the day, if you're going to let other people dictate your abuse, and in a way make you do something which is harmful to others, then in actual fact they won. That's exactly what they wanted. The people who killed the people in Paris, you know what, if there had been less coverage about it, if people had simply condemned it, not less coverage, I think it got a good amount of coverage, but if there had not been that response, and if the whole world had said, you know what, we're not going to publish this because we respect the Muslims in our community, there would have been such an outpouring of kindness and love from the Muslim community to France. And the people who could have been radicalised as a result, and probably may very well have been radicalised now, they wouldn't have done so, and they may have been turned away. People don't realise you're walking into the very thing that you want to avoid.
What you're trying to say is, so, like, it sounds like what you're trying to say is...
Sorry, he had another question.
Okay, perhaps
Can I
address
just
this
add
one.
to it? Because
Yeah,
it's really
okay,
good, yeah.
go on.
So if someone's bullying you, you just back down and you don't say anything because in the end it'll be better for you.
No, I don't think
And
that's...
also Claire had something about how you believe the cartoon had no purpose, and cartoons like that are just abuse and mockery. And you mentioned a lot. Well, do you know that satire was used by the rebels against them? And there were pictures showing Hitler in some offensive manners, and the purpose of that was to try and make someone as big and powerful as Hitler seem less scary, to sort of mockery and insult is often a way to voice opinions when they can't be voiced. So to you, while it might seem like plain abuse, to others it might not. It might seem as a method of a last-ditch method of rebellion, like it was used in Nazi Germany.
Sure.
But when you mention Nazi Germany, you only mention how the Nazis used satire against the Jews, not how the rebels used it against Hitler. Hitler persecuted people that painted him in a negative light, through pictures, through posters. So
if we could... we tease out the two. I think there are two main points in that. First of all, I just want to clarify. I'm not against satire. Part of my talk was about showing that satire is distinct from abuse.
You mentioned negative uses of it.
No, I'm saying that the uses that Charlie Hebdo was not actually satire. Actually, I was saying that it wasn't actually satire at all, and that actually it was a caricature of satire, which is something I think we should definitely come back to. But would it be possible to summarise those points, because I think there's quite a few points in there.
Well, one part was that isn't it a kind of bullying to say we're not allowed to show pictures of Muhammad?
Yeah, and the other part of the point was is that you're it's a means of fighting back, but maybe answer the points you raised first.
I don't think I meant it in exactly that way. You said if no one if the media coverage had been lesser and people had sort of not criticised Islam after the event, there would have been an outpouring of Paris and France. That's sort of like saying, hard to explain, but it's sort of like if someone was to punish me and if I was to say something back, to go to the head teacher and make a big deal about it, that it's my own fault if it's worse next time because I started to about it.
Not at all.
That's sort of what it sounded like you were trying to say.
No, it's not, and it's not the same, because what it would actually be the same as is if somebody punches you in the face and somebody told you not even to go to the head teacher. Because when the people were killed in Paris, it got media coverage. Everybody knew about it, didn't they?
Yeah, but you said...
So actually it's more akin to the allegory or the metaphor of somebody punching you in the face, you going and telling the head teacher, telling everybody in the school, and everybody in the school then going up to you and supporting you verbally and vocally and not encouraging you to punch the person back. And is that how we deal with bullies in society? Is that how we're taught to deal with people? Somebody punches you, you punch them back.
Should I say anything about punching back?
Okay. There was no punching back in Paris. I don't remember anybody going shooting Muslims after the...
Well, actually, I disagree with that. I think you may need to go on your news.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, so I'd like to take as many little questions.
I think he had a
Perhaps if you could answer that one quickly, both of you. And
what was the question?
It was still on the concept of abstraction in
abstract. I think that for some people, Muslims have become a go-to blame thing. I think in the UK it's less of an issue because, as I said, I think it's about education. But you have these 3 kids who were murdered the other day in Chapel Hill. I don't know whether you saw it in Missouri. A Somali kid leaving a mosque was run over and his legs were cut off and he died. They've arrested the individual. It seems to be coming out that he killed him for the pure reason that basically he was presumably wearing Islamic dress walking out of the mosque.
Sorry, the question was more though about how this is the personification of the problems of the totality. So
it may be because also Muslims are often from a different ethnic background in Western countries, and so there's an issue of racism and immigration issues that feeds into it very nicely. There's also a concept of not integrating within communities. The Islamic teachings are that loyalty to one's country is actually part of your faith, and as the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, we really try to emphasise that. So while people are burning poppies, this year actually the Royal British Legion named a particular day, Remembrance Day, after they call it the Ahmadiyya Muslim Poppy Day, because every year we raise £250,000 for them or so. So I think that Muslims have a responsibility to do more, but I think that Muslims have, to a degree, for some people, become a go-to blame thing. But the cure to that is education, both Muslims and everyone else.
Yeah, I see among some people I know it's true that there's a antipathy towards Muslims in society. I think partly it's because over the years, as Britain's become more multicultural, there's not really been very much of a conversation going on about the differences and similarities between different groups of people, and that there's misunderstandings grown up, and certain questions have been avoided along the way. The one I hear a lot about is halal. People saying, there's the food in the school canteen is halal, or the food in this restaurant is halal. Why are they, in inverted commas, allowed to do that? And there wouldn't be this resentment if there had been a proper conversation along the way about what's going on and why.
I agree. I think the conversation is often actually deeply polarised to extremes. We only get together and start talking about these issues when 12 people are murdered in an office, or when we haven't actually even talked about the Copenhagen shooting actually at all, mainly because I haven't actually had a good read of it because it only happened very recently. But it was at an event like this. It was an event on free speech that the person was murdered.
Bring up another question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, another question. Do you want to go?
Okay, so what's concerned me so far is the two speakers basically agree. There's a couple of comments, and I think one underlying question that I worry about is, so at the point where we see two speeches that were pretty much identical, I mean, there were different approaches, but basically they came down to the idea that free speech shouldn't be legally restricted, it should be the golden rule. It should be, is this something I want someone to say about me, and is this something I should say? And I worry if the questions in this sort of dialogue becomes asking people to defend very extremes of their own ideas. I mean, I don't expect the second speaker to protect or defend every instance of a Muslim doing anything. And I worry that these cases are being brought up as an atheist, as a Canadian actually. I'm really glad you brought up that Canadian example. And I worry, so can we please bring the questions back to maybe this discussion on free speech and sort of bringing that in. Where do the speakers think ignorance comes into this question, and how do we best deal with thoughts brought forward from ignorance with that, and how can we best deal with that sort of thing?
Do you mean when people express opinions that are ignorant?
Well, so the principle brought up in both your speeches were this should be a moral duty to police yourself. This should be something you think about, should I say this?
I would disagree. I think that there were points of difference, and I've written them down actually while you were speaking.
Good, please clarify that.
Yeah. It's a difficult topic. It is a difficult topic. I would say that one of them is the fact that he's my esteemed fellow, Adrian. My apologies. That's why I said that. I know Adrian. He said that mockery and ridicule is a valid means of criticism. I don't think mockery and ridicule, with the intention of purely mockery and ridicule, is a valid means of criticism. I think criticism can always be better than that, and can always put forward its views with respect to other people's sensibilities and sensitivities.
Well, I noticed that the law was changed because the hate speech law did say you're not allowed to threaten, abuse or insult. And the insults was removed. I think it was Rowan Atkinson who had the campaign to have that removed from the law. Because it seems to be going too far. Threatening, okay, that's threatening the physical harm. Abuse, which seems to suggest mental cruelty. But to insult somebody is something that I don't think is within the remit of the law. You could imagine the police in the pub on a Friday night checking whether anybody's insulting anybody else or not. That's what it feels like on Twitter now, that the Twitter has become the pub of the 21st century. Yet now we've got the police in the pub checking that we're not insulting each other, which seems ridiculous.
Can we have another point?
Yes.
There's a point there. Yeah.
Kasi, my question is to you. What type of society or what model of society or any country society you are actually proposing that we should be living with peace and harmony, not in hell or heaven. We want to make this earth worth living. Because we have seen through all these religious fights in the past and in the history, when perhaps you are not maybe born, when India and Pakistan made, on the basis of religion. 1.5 million people were killed at that time. And the society we are looking at, where is that and how we need to keep that up? Because beliefs, it is a people's personal thing. They should carry on what they want to believe. But we want a better place this earth. That's our job to keep it up.
From the perspective of, I feel like applauding this question. Thank you for the excellent question. I think one of the key aspects of your question to how do we build that better society is that one of the aspects is something which is actually unique to the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, often as a single religious community in regards to the greater panoply or community of Islam or Muslims, is that we advocate the separation between the mosque and the state completely. And it's something that we can certainly hopefully agree upon, because that is something that's happened in Pakistan. You've had the state taking on a particular religious viewpoint and legislating on the basis of that, and resulting in a whole load of persecution over the last 40 years, especially with the anti-Ahmadi laws. So I think that there should definitely be a separation of mosque and state, but I think the best way to get to this kind of ideal is to understand what secularism is. People fundamentally misunderstand what secularism is today, and I think people, especially in the atheist, secularist and humanist society, broadly, and in the humanist community, misunderstand what secularism is. Secularism is not anti-religion. That is not what secularism is. Secularism is actually a space in which everybody is free to be what they are and what they believe, as long as it doesn't harm anyone else. So stopping somebody from wearing a headscarf in a governmental position is not secularism. It's actually the exact opposite of secularism. So I think that the best way to go about it is creating a society which is purely and truly secular, both in form and in function.
Yeah, I don't think we do misunderstand what secularism is.
Not necessarily as an individual, but I have noticed it, that people use the term secular to basically mean anti-religion. They say, oh, this is a secular thing. No, it's not a secular thing. Just because something's religious doesn't make it anti-secular.
Okay, a couple more points. So,
well, I think we're secularism is anti-religion because religion is actually anti-secular. It doesn't promote secularism at all.
No, I disagree.
Well, how?
It depends on which religious group, perhaps.
Yes, of course. I mean, to say that, there are over 1 billion Muslims, for example. The number of people who are religious in the world is well into the several billion. To say all of their religion, none of their points of view accommodate secularism is extremist.
In these holy books, they don't promote tolerance to other faiths. To other...
Really?
No, not at all.
Have you read the Quran?
Well, I've read quotes
You've read quotes from the Quran?
You put up 2 quotes of the Quran, but then you ignore the violent parts of the Quran as well.
Which violent part are you talking about?
Pardon?
Which violent part are you talking about?
There's probably about 20 verses in the Quran.
Really, about 20?
About talks about disbelievers.
Really, okay. Would you be able to read them out for me?
Yeah.
Please do.
I don't know them off by heart, so
I think that perhaps you need to go away and read the Quran as a book before perhaps making statements on the basis of it.
There's some other points. So, in the blue jump.
I was just going to say, maybe there's a need for a bit of understanding as to why France banned the burqa. I think it's because of the context of the Holocaust, and there was, in Germany, they forced Jews to wear an armband that identified them as Jews, and France as a secular state, they wanted sort of to remove articles of faith so that people couldn't judge on their faith in public. And I just think that's quite one way of works when people do.
I wouldn't, because there's a difference between an individual choosing. I agree. If a person is forced to wear the burqa by their husband, by their father, that's wrong, and Islam gives no sanction for it. Right? If a person chooses to wear the burqa, it's a bit different to a government instituting an armband for a Jewish person. One is an external application, somebody else is telling you that you have to identify yourself as this. Another is a person self-identifying. We self-identify all the time about lots of things. When you wear a University of Birmingham t-shirt outside, you're self-identifying. Should somebody say, well, actually, University of Birmingham, it's not as good as Cambridge. We don't want you to be subjected to persecution because you go to Birmingham University. I mean, I'm taking it to a ridiculous state, but if a person chooses to identify in that manner, and I would very much question whether that was actually the reason it was banned, that they wanted to save Muslim women from persecution. And if that's the case, then why is there a law against wearing the hijab, wearing a head covering in a governmental position?
Okay. Yeah.
You talk a lot about mockery and people getting offended by the intention of the person offending. But there's also someone at the other receiving end of it, and people will look at things differently. So, like, if you look at the cartoons, what you deem to be mockery, someone else could say, well, I don't agree with that because it's my faith, but I'm not going to go about it in an aggressive way. And the fact is that Charlie Hebdo case, even though that doesn't represent Muslims at all, in the wider scale, there was a violent act. And it's not always the job of the person offending, which is the issue. People respond to things in different ways.
I agree.
And I think when you mentioned a comment about isolating, younger Muslims who do turn to radicalism, but that is their own personal failing, rather than always a society who imposes that on them.
I completely agree, but no man is an island. And if we have an objective to try and, in particular this year, for example, and this time that we're in, to decrease radicalization with the growth of ISIS and things, I think that it's almost more of a responsibility of our communities to promoting kind of interfaith harmony and harmony between people with no faith and who follow a religion. And I had a whole slide on how Muslims should also react to these things, and that they should follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which was to forgive and turn away. So I hope that I haven't entirely just focused on the fact that you shouldn't offend others. Perhaps we have, because that's in a way the more contentious issue. But people should express forgiveness and they should move forward with their lives, basically. But this is the issue we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, although I think we should have the right to insult, like I said before, that I can see the value of working together, especially with, it's obviously much worse for society if we move to the extremes rather than if we move to the centre. So that's why personally I would choose not to put, to show the cartoon or what, for example. I feel that I would have felt, like I said, I would have felt doing a march, I would have felt somewhat hypocritical, because I'm not the kind of person that would show those kind of cartoons. But hopefully for a good reason, not just because I'm scared. Because that seems to be a sad reason not to do anything.
One thing that, I don't know how you'll take this, and I haven't entirely formed this thought in my own head, so this may come out badly, but a few weeks prior to the murder of the 12 people, and you should never count murders in numbers, I think. It's a very stupid way of counting murders and tragedies. A tragedy is a tragedy for the individuals involved. But a few weeks earlier, he says, and then he goes on to do exactly that, a few weeks earlier, 127 children were murdered in Peshawar, in Pakistan. I didn't see any world leaders get together. I didn't see millions of people marching. And I would say 127 children murdered is just as, people would say more, I don't like saying more, tragic. I'd say it's just as tragic as 12 people being murdered. But it showed you a very clear difference in the way that we prioritize people's deaths in our world.
Okay, I think.
I was going to just reply to that. I'm just wondering, I remember seeing in the news pictures after the Charlie Hebdo massacre of demonstrations in Pakistan in support of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. And I'm just wondering whether I saw any demonstrations in Pakistan, demonstrations against the killings of Peshawar. Because you need to be careful making these comparisons.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You should really be careful. And Pakistan is a country which is, as a result of its state theocracy, has in a way radicalized entire populations, unfortunately, and entire huge groups. And this is why I think the best way to tackle radicalization, the caliph, the khalifa, and you may be surprised to know that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community has a caliph, and has had a caliph for 125 years now, and he's a caliph of peace. His name is Mirza Masroor Ahmed. He was interviewed by LBC Radio, and he was asked, how would we tackle extremism? And he said, one, have your police guard themselves more, and have more police who are able to protect themselves in terms of actual physically, and also in terms of have more armed police around important sites especially. And the second thing he said, which was very pertinent, he said, in your mosques in Britain, you should be knowing which mosques are preaching radical and radicalizing people in public. Because in Pakistan, he himself has been a victim of this. He was put in prison for being an Ahmadiyya Muslim in Pakistan before he was appointed as the leader of our community. Because this is what happened in Pakistan. You have had generations of individuals in which hate has been preached in mosques against Ahmadiyya Muslims, against Shia Muslims, and so you get a massive radicalization of huge numbers. And so this is an onus and a responsibility upon Muslims. And I totally disagree with the attitude of the Muslim Council of Britain in their response to Eric Pickle's letter that no, we don't have anything to do. We do have stuff to do. And we do have to demonstrate our Britishness in the society. And that's exactly what the head of our community, how he responded to it as well.
Adrian, I think we've run out of time. We'll give you the last word, if that's okay, if you have anything
Oh,
to say. But I think we've come to the end now.
Well, that just reminded me, we talk about freedom of speech, how, you know, I'm a teacher, and I sometimes, I can see the effect of the internet, YouTube on young children. It's not, speaking of Muslims, it's not so much the mosque, it's not the parents, it's what they see on the internet. And I don't think we want any kind of censorship of YouTube, but we need some education, whether it's whoever it might be, is going to end up being the key, and not new laws about censorship.
Thanks very much, all of you, and thank you especially to our speakers who gave very impressive presentations. Thank you all for coming. I've got a mailing list here, so if you want to find out kind of more of our events in the future, then I'll leave that at the side, and feel free to write your names down. Other than that, thanks very much.